Welcome. Tonight we'll drift together through the long, winding story of the British Empire. It is not a tale of battles and power alone, but a story of quiet lives, small details, and how ordinary people lived through centuries of change. Our journey begins far back, long before the word empire was ever used for Britain. Imagine the early island, cool winds sweeping across green hills and quiet valleys. Long before London became a bustling city, there were villages of wooden huts and farmers tending sheep. Life was simple, with hearth fires glowing at night, and the steady rhythm of the sea always nearby. These were the beginnings of Britain, an island people shaped by tides, trade, and travelers who arrived from distant shores. Over the centuries, visitors and settlers came from many places. The Romans, with their stone roads and warm bathhouses, once ruled the island. You might picture Roman soldiers in their sandals, marching in the drizzle, or local Britons selling bread and pottery in small markets by the road. When the Romans left, Britain became a quieter place again, dotted with farms, monasteries, and little wooden churches where monks wrote books by candlelight. Centuries passed. By the Middle Ages, villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. Castles rose up on hilltops, with banners fluttering in the wind, while markets bustled with wool, fish, and spices. The people of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland lived lives both hard and beautiful, plowing fields, tending animals, baking bread, weaving cloth, singing songs in the evenings by the fire. Though kings and queens ruled, it was the ordinary rhythm of daily life that truly shaped the island. By the late 1400s and early 1500s, the world began to feel larger. Ships sailed farther than before, their sails filled with the wind of curiosity and trade. For people living in small English towns, news of strange, distant lands must have felt like tales from a dream. Imagine a fisherman hauling nets on the cold coast, hearing whispers that somewhere far across the ocean were lands of golden beaches and new fruits no one had ever tasted. The thought itself would have seemed magical, a faraway echo that stirred wonder. The age of exploration arrived. Ships set out from English harbors, their wooden decks creaking, their sailors carrying hopes of fortune and adventure. These early voyages were small compared to what would follow, but they planted seeds of connection. The British Empire, as history would later call it, began not with sudden conquest, but with sailors trading wool for wine, or tin for cloth, and slowly learning the ways of distant peoples. At home, life in Britain was still rooted in the everyday. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the sound of bells ringing from parish churches, the chatter of markets on cobbled streets. These were the real heartbeat of the time. Families worked together, children helped in fields or learned crafts, and evenings were spent around hearths, listening to stories passed down through generations. But slowly, steadily, the island looked outward. Across the sea lay Ireland, where English and Scottish settlers moved in, shaping the first colonies. The relationship was often uneasy, but for many ordinary people, it was simply life, farming land, tending cattle, or fishing in quiet rivers. By the 1600s, ships sailed not only to Ireland, but across the Atlantic toward the vast lands of North America. Imagine a small wooden ship leaving Plymouth or Bristol, filled with families carrying chests of clothes, seeds for planting, and Bibles for prayer. The journey was long and cold, Months of rocking waves and salted meat, of sleeping in cramped quarters by candlelight. Yet for them, it was the start of something unknown, a chance to build homes in a new land. As colonies formed in America and the Caribbean, life for settlers was a mixture of hardship and hope. They built wooden houses, planted corn and tobacco, and learned the seasons of lands so different from the cool rains of England. For many, evenings still meant sitting by the fire, telling stories, knitting, or playing simple music, the familiar comforts of home carried into a new world. Meanwhile, in London, the heart of Britain pulsed with growth. The Thames flowed steadily through the city, lined with ships unloading spices, sugar, and cloth from faraway places. The air was filled with the cries of merchants, the clatter of carts, and the smell of roasting meats from taverns. For those who lived there, the empire was not just a word, but something you could see in the markets. Nutmeg from the Spice Islands, tea from China, tobacco from Virginia. Ordinary Londoners may not have thought of themselves as part of a great empire, but in their daily meals, in the cups of tea warming their hands, the empire was already part of their lives. And so, the British Empire grew slowly, almost quietly, like a tree putting down roots. It was not yet the mighty empire it would become, but in villages, in towns, in colonies overseas, the threads of a vast story were being woven together. A story of sailors and farmers, traders and weavers, children playing in fields, and families dreaming by the fire. And as you picture this world, you may let your eyes grow heavy. Imagine walking through a small English town in the 1600s, hearing the soft clip-clop of horses on stone, smelling bread from the baker's shop, and feeling the cool evening air settling over the rooftops. The story of the empire is not only about power, but about countless quiet lives, lives not so different from our own. As the 1700s unfolded, Britain began to look farther across the oceans, its ships like small wooden bridges between distant worlds. The island itself remained much the same: green fields, small cottages with smoke rising from chimneys, markets filled with chatter and laughter. But the rhythm of life was now touched by places far beyond the horizon. Picture a London dock in the early morning. The mist hangs low over the Thames, and the wooden masts of ships rise like a forest of poles against the pale sky. Sailors heave crates of goods, sugar in heavy barrels, fragrant spices wrapped in cloth, and bundles of cloth dyed in deep colors. Dockside taverns stir awake, serving mugs of ale to tired workers. For many Londoners, the empire was visible in these simple physical things: the taste of tea, the sweetness of sugar, the aroma of tobacco curling through the air. In the countryside, too, empire made itself felt. Families who once drank only water or ale now sipped tea with their bread. Shops in towns displayed fabrics from India, brightly patterned in ways that seemed almost magical compared to plain English wool. Small luxuries crept quietly into everyday life, and with them, a sense that the world was larger than anyone could walk. The colonies overseas continued to grow. In North America, settlements stretched along the coast, from New England's wooden farmhouses to Virginia's tobacco fields. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations spread across warm, humid islands, where the sound of waves met the steady rhythm of mills grinding cane. For those who lived there, life was hard, often exhausting, yet also filled with simple patterns. Meals shared under palm trees, songs sung in the evening, the scent of the sea never far away. Meanwhile, in India, the British East India Company expanded its reach. At first, it was a company of traders, seeking cloth and spices, exchanging goods in bustling markets. Imagine the streets of Calcutta or Madras, filled with the calls of merchants, the glow of lanterns, the smell of curry, and the chatter of many languages. British traders walked these streets, writing letters back home about the heat, the colors, the foods they had never tasted before. It was not yet an empire of governments and armies, but one of trade, of quiet exchanges at crowded stalls. Back in Britain, ordinary life carried on in quiet ways. Farmers rose with the dawn, tending sheep or plowing fields. Children ran to village schools, carrying slates and books. Women baked bread in heavy ovens, their kitchens warm with the scent of yeast. On Sundays, families walked to church, the sound of bells echoing over the hills. The empire was far away, yet present in small details. A blue and white teacup from China, a silver spoon from the West Indies, or a newspaper filled with news of places most would never see. By the mid-1700s, Britain found itself in wars that stretched across oceans. But for those listening to this story in a sleepy state, the details of battles need not concern us. Instead, think of how life continued despite them. A farmer still milked his cows in Devon. A young girl still learned her letters in Edinburgh. A fisherman still cast his nets in Cornwall. Empires rise and shift, but daily life, with its quiet rhythms, always goes on. Toward the end of the century, change arrived in North America. Colonists there, long tied to Britain, began to seek independence. The American Revolution unfolded, and Britain lost many of its colonies across the Atlantic. For some in Britain, this was felt like a great blow, but for the ordinary people, life moved steadily on. They still gathered in taverns, drank tea, and told stories by the fire. The loss of America closed one chapter, but the empire was far from over. Indeed, as the 1800s dawned, Britain's reach grew in other directions. The Industrial Revolution began to transform the island itself. Imagine towns lit by smoky lamps, the hum of looms weaving cloth, and the whistle of trains beginning to appear on the landscape. Britain became a place of factories and canals, where workers poured into cities each morning, and chimneys marked the skyline. For families, this meant new rhythms. Breakfasts of porridge eaten quickly before the factory bell. Long days at the loom or machine, followed by evenings in crowded streets where music and laughter echoed from pubs. Children played in alleyways, skipping stones or chasing hoops, their shouts mingling with the rumble of carts. And yet, even in this industrial world, empire was present. Cotton from India and the American South filled the mills. Tea from Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, and porcelain from China filled cupboards. At the same time, in far-off lands, Britain's presence grew. Australia became a colony, first with ships of convicts sent across the world to build new lives. Imagine those long voyages, months at sea, waves rocking the ship, the creak of wood, the endless blue horizon. Arriving in Australia, settlers built huts, grew crops, and began again in a land of eucalyptus trees, parrots, and kangaroos. It was another thread woven into the vast fabric of empire. In India, The East India Company's role deepened, becoming not only a trader but a ruler. Markets still bustled, palaces still gleamed, but now the Union Jack appeared in cities, and British officials lived in grand houses shaded by wide verandas. Yet alongside these rulers, daily life for millions continued as always: fishermen casting nets, women grinding spices, children learning songs, and families gathering under stars. The empire was vast, but life was still rooted in the small and the ordinary. By the mid-1800s, the British Empire was often said to be the largest in the world. Red patches on maps marked lands across every ocean. Yet for someone sitting in a small English village, empire might mean nothing more than a letter from a cousin in Canada, or a parcel of tea sent from India. It was something both grand and distant, and at the same time, close and personal. As you let your eyes close now, you might picture a simple London street in the 1800s. Gas lamps glowing softly in the fog, horses pulling carriages through cobbled lanes, and families gathered around their tables for supper. A child sips warm tea, a mother knits by the fire, a father reads a newspaper by lamplight. In that quiet moment, the British Empire, with all its distant lands, is reduced to something very small: a home, a family, a cup of tea, and the slow turning of another day. By the mid-1800s, Britain stood at the heart of a vast, sprawling empire. Maps painted in shades of red gave the impression of a world knit together by the Union Jack. Yet for most people, the empire was not a grand idea, but a quiet presence. It appeared in the cup of tea held between their hands, in the cloth of their clothes, or in a letter written in neat ink from a cousin overseas. In the reign of Queen Victoria, the empire grew larger still. The Queen herself became a symbol of stability, her portraits hanging in schools, railway stations, and colonial offices thousands of miles from London. Yet, behind the pomp and ceremony, life was still carried by the soft rhythms of daily existence. Picture a Victorian street at dusk: narrow houses of red brick, a milkman's cart clattering over cobblestones, and children playing marbles on the pavement until their mothers called them inside. Industry thrived, and with it came invention. Railways spread across Britain, carrying passengers in wooden carriages with brass lamps glowing faintly. Steamships crossed oceans, making distant lands feel a little closer. Telegraph wires stretched overhead, carrying messages that once took months in only minutes. But while these marvels of progress changed the pace of life, they also created new moments of stillness. Families could now gather around a piano in the evening, singing songs lit by lamplight, with a fire warming the hearth. Across the seas, the empire touched lives in different ways. In Canada, towns grew from wooden forts into bustling settlements with shops and schools. Families there built homes with wide porches to face the snowy winters. And in the evenings, the glow of lamplight spilled onto the snow. In India, British officials lived in airy bungalows shaded by trees, sipping tea on verandas, while Indian families continued their own traditions, celebrating festivals, weaving cloth, cooking spices that filled the air with rich aroma. In Africa, traders set up along coastlines, exchanging goods beneath the hot sun, while inland, small villages carried on with rhythms unchanged for centuries, grinding grain, tending cattle, telling stories beneath the stars. For the average British family at home, empire was often a distant curiosity. Newspapers carried reports of faraway wars and explorers trekking through deserts and jungles. Children, tucked into bed at night, sometimes dreamed of elephants in India or palm trees in the Caribbean after hearing such stories. Yet when morning came, they still hurried off to school carrying slates and ink pots, or ran errands to the baker, where fresh loaves were stacked in neat rows. The grandeur of empire faded into the simple smell of bread and the sound of church bells. The Victorian age was also one of manners and rituals. Afternoon tea became a beloved custom, with delicate cups of china, plates of small cakes, and pots of steaming leaves imported from India and Ceylon. Imagine the quiet clink of spoons against porcelain, the murmur of conversation, the fire crackling softly in the grate. For many families, tea was not just a drink but a pause, a moment of calm in the day. In towns and cities, shop windows glowed with goods from across the empire: polished wooden furniture from the Caribbean, carpets from India, ivory trinkets from Africa, and silks from China. Children pressed their noses against the glass, marveling at the colors and textures, while their parents weighed the cost of buying a simple shawl or a tin of biscuits. These goods made the empire feel close, even if the lands they came from were unimaginably far. Life in Victorian Britain was not always easy. The growing cities were crowded, smoky, and often dirty. Workers toiled long hours in factories, the air thick with soot, while children played in narrow streets with little space. Yet even here, moments of peace could be found. Families gathering for Sunday dinners of roast potatoes, men whistling tunes as they walked home from work, women gossiping over laundry lines, and children skipping rope under gas lamps that flickered into the night. In the countryside, life moved more slowly. Villages remained tied to the seasons, with harvest festivals, maple dances, and church bells marking time. Farmers rose early, their breath steaming in the cold air, and worked fields edged by stone walls and hedges. At night, they gathered with families by the fire, knitting, reading, or mending tools. The empire may have stretched across the world, but for them, it was felt most in the presence of new crops like potatoes, tea, and sugar that flavored their meals. By the late 1800s, the empire had reached its height. From Canada to India, from Africa to Australia, the sun was said never to set on British lands. And yet, for all its size, the empire was lived most intimately in small, personal moments. A sailor writing to his family from a port in Singapore, a missionary teaching children beneath a palm tree, a British family in Manchester passing around a book filled with sketches of distant lands, the children wide-eyed with curiosity. And still, ordinary evenings carried on. Streets dimmed as lamps were lit. Market stalls were packed away, the smell of fish and fruit fading into the night. Families closed shutters against the cool air, and the hush of sleep spread over towns and cities. Far away, in colonies across the oceans, other families prepared for rest as well. In huts, in bungalows, in wooden cottages by rivers or fields. Each lived different lives, yet all shared the same simple rhythm: work, rest, food, family, and dreams. As you breathe slowly now, you might imagine walking through a quiet Victorian home. The hallway lined with coats and hats, the ticking of a clock in the sitting room, a mother gently tucking a child into bed, smoothing the blanket, while the sound of a piano drifts from another room. Outside, A lamplighter moves down the street, touching each lamp with his pole until the night glows softly. This was the height of the British Empire, not just in maps and power, but in countless small, ordinary moments of life. By the closing years of the 1800s, the British Empire stretched farther than ever before. Maps in schoolrooms showed oceans of pale blue and wide patches of red, and children traced their fingers over the shapes of lands most would never see. But for all its size, the empire was still made real not by boundaries or battles, but by the small details of daily life. Imagine a classroom in London around 1890. Rows of wooden desks, the smell of chalk on a slate board, and sunlight falling through tall windows. The children sit in neat rows, reciting lessons in steady voices. On the wall hangs a large map, its corners curled with the empire's territories colored red. To the children, it looks almost like a puzzle of the world, though to them, it is only an image, while their actual lives are filled with books, playground games, and the occasional sweet purchased from a shop. In towns and cities, the empire's presence lingered in ordinary ways. Tea had become a staple, no longer a luxury, poured from shining kettles into cups chipped from years of use. The Sunday roast, with potatoes, carrots, and perhaps a pudding, was flavored with pepper and sugar. Small luxuries once exotic, now taken for granted. Shopkeepers displayed jars of currants, tins of biscuits, and packets of cocoa. These simple things, bought in passing, carried whispers of distant plantations, ships, and workers, though most customers gave it little thought. Far across the seas, the empire was lived in other rhythms. In Africa, British settlers built towns with wide streets and whitewashed houses, shaded by trees. In India, railways spread across the land, their iron tracks gleaming under the sun, carrying travelers from crowded cities to quiet villages. In Australia and New Zealand, sheep farms stretched for miles, with shepherds riding on horseback under wide skies. Each colony had its own life, its own sounds, its own scents. Yet the empire tied them loosely together, like threads knotted in a vast tapestry. The late Victorian era was also an age of curiosity. Newspapers carried tales of explorers crossing deserts and jungles, scientists cataloging plants and animals from faraway places. Families at home might sit by the fire reading such accounts aloud, their imagination stirred. A father in Yorkshire might read to his children about lions in Africa, while the wind rattled the windows of their stone cottage. A mother in Wales might knit while listening to her husband describe the wonders of India, though neither of them would ever travel farther than a nearby city. As the 20th century approached, the empire seemed solid, even permanent. Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, marking 60 years on the throne. Streets were filled with parades, flags fluttered, and bells rang across Britain and its colonies. Yet beneath the pageantry, quiet changes were already stirring. In India, voices of independence began to rise, though softly at first. In Ireland, movements for self-rule grew stronger, and in Britain itself, life was modernizing, shifting away from the old rhythms. Think of an early 1900s city street. Electric lamps now lit the roads, glowing white instead of yellow. Trams rattled by, carrying passengers in neat hats and coats. Shop windows sparkled with new goods, gramophones playing scratchy tunes, bicycles lined in rows, and books printed more cheaply than ever before. Cafes bustled with chatter as men read newspapers and women sipped tea beneath curling smoke. Life felt quicker, yet still carried its pauses. Quiet evenings at home, children dozing after a day at school, and families gathered around fires that burned steadily against the night. At the same time, the colonies changed too. In India, children played cricket in dusty fields, copying a sport brought from Britain but made their own. In Africa, mission schools opened, where children wrote letters in neat English while speaking their own languages at home. In Canada, cities like Toronto and Montreal filled with trams, churches, and busy markets. In Australia, families built new suburbs with gardens of roses and eucalyptus trees. Everywhere, the empire blended with local traditions, creating new ways of life. But history, like the tide, does not remain still. In 1914, a great war began. The First World War touched the empire in deep ways. Soldiers came not only from Britain, but from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa. Yet, as always, while armies marched, ordinary life continued in quieter rhythms. Farmers still rose at dawn to milk cows. Children still walked to school with satchels on their backs. Mothers still prepared meals, boiled kettles, and soothed little ones to sleep. The war was vast, but life carried on in countless small kitchens, fields, and streets. When the war ended in 1918, the empire had changed. New nations emerged, like Canada and Australia, which began to govern themselves more independently, even as they remained tied to Britain. In Ireland, a long struggle brought partition, with the South moving toward independence. Across the empire, voices grew stronger, asking for self-rule, for dignity, for freedom. And yet, daily life remained filled with familiar comforts: Sunday dinners, church bells, songs sung in pubs, and evenings spent reading by lamplight. In the 1920s and 1930s, Britain itself shifted again. Cities grew, cinemas appeared, and jazz music drifted through dance halls. The empire was still vast, but many people thought more about their own towns than about faraway colonies. A young couple in Manchester might save to buy a wireless radio. A boy in Glasgow might cheer for his favorite football team. A girl in Birmingham might read novels in her bedroom by torchlight. The empire existed in the background, but life was made up of these small, tender details. When the Second World War arrived in 1939, the empire once again gathered its strength. Troops came from India, Africa, Canada, and Australia, joining British soldiers across many battlefields. At home, families endured blackouts, rationing, and the steady hum of planes overhead. But even then, there were quiet moments. A grandmother knitting by candlelight, children playing games in underground shelters, neighbors sharing tea despite shortages. The empire was caught in a storm, yet daily life found ways to hold on, even in its gentlest forms. By the war's end in 1945, the empire had begun to fade. The world had changed, and new nations sought independence. Yet, as the empire declined, the sense of connection it left behind endured. In the foods eaten, the sports played, the stories told, and the friendships carried across seas. As you breathe slowly now, you might picture a street in Britain in the 1940s. The war is over. The lamps glow again after years of darkness. Families gather at tables with simple meals, grateful for peace. Children laugh in the street, kicking a ball until dusk falls. In those quiet, ordinary moments, the story of empire moves gently toward its end. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Britain stood victorious, but weary. Its cities had been bombed, its people rationed, its economy stretched thin. The empire was still wide on maps, but it was no longer firm in reality. Across the seas, nations that had long been under British rule began to seek their own paths. And so, slowly, gently, the empire that had once been called the greatest in the world began to soften, to loosen its grip, and to change into something new. In India, independence came in 1947. The Union Jack was lowered, and new flags rose in the warm air. For ordinary families in Britain, this moment was far away, a headline in the newspaper, or a radio announcement heard after supper. They still went about their days as usual, walking to work in gray coats, buying fish wrapped in paper, tending gardens filled with roses. And yet, in small ways, change was felt. Indian restaurants began to open in British cities, and the scent of curry began to mingle with the familiar aroma of fish and chips. The pattern repeated elsewhere, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia. Countries that had once been painted red on school maps declared independence. Each did so in its own way, sometimes with celebrations, sometimes with difficulty, but always with a quiet determination to govern themselves. And in Britain, the news reached living rooms by wireless radio or flickering black and white television screens. Families listened while sipping tea, knitting, or reading, the world shifting gently in the background while their own evenings stayed calm and familiar. The 1950s and 1960s were years of change at home as well. Britain rebuilt from the war, with new houses rising where rubble had once lain, and new shops filling the high streets. The sound of rock and roll drifted from record players, and teenagers danced in living rooms and village halls. Women hung laundry in back gardens. Men rode bicycles to factories or offices, and children played hopscotch on chalk pavements. The empire, though fading, lingered in the foods eaten, the books read, and the friendships made with neighbors who had come from distant parts of the former empire to settle in Britain. By the 1970s and 1980s, Britain was no longer an empire, but rather a nation among many. And yet, the threads of its long history remained woven into daily life. Cricket was played not only in English villages, but in parks in India, Jamaica, Australia, and South Africa. The English language, once carried abroad by traders and officials, was now spoken in classrooms and marketplaces across the globe. Afternoon tea was a ritual not just in London, but in Nairobi, Delhi, and Melbourne. What had once been empire became instead a shared culture, carried forward in quiet ways. The Commonwealth of Nations emerged, not an empire, but a family of countries, each independent, each equal, yet connected by history, language, and friendship. Leaders met at conferences, but for most people, it was felt in simpler ways. In shared sports tournaments, in books exchanged, in music carried on radio waves across oceans. A family in Britain might cheer for a cricket match played in India. A singer in Jamaica might top the charts in London. A teacher in Canada might write to a pen friend in Australia. These small connections were the gentle echoes of an empire now transformed. In the late 20th century and into the 21st, Britain itself became home to people from all across the world. Walk through a street in London today, and you can hear dozens of languages. See shops selling spices from Asia, fabrics from Africa, and breads from the Middle East. Families from India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and beyond have made new lives in Britain, bringing with them traditions, foods, and music that have blended into the fabric of daily life. The empire has ended, but its legacy lives on in the diversity of modern Britain. Yet through all this, the simple rhythms of life remain much the same as they ever were. Families still gather around tables for Sunday meals. Children still walk to school with books in their hands, and neighbors still greet each other over fences and hedges. The story of empire, its rise, its height, and its fall, is vast, but at its heart are countless ordinary lives, lived quietly, day by day. Think of a small English town now. The church bells still ring on Sundays. The market square still fills with the sound of traders selling fruit and flowers. In the evening, families close their curtains, switch on lamps, and settle into armchairs. A grandmother knits while listening to the radio. A father reads a newspaper. Children curl up in pajamas, listening to bedtime stories before drifting off to sleep. Outside, the night is quiet, the same as it has been for centuries. And if you look outward, across the world, you will see countless other scenes just as gentle. A family in Delhi sharing a meal of rice and curry. Children in Jamaica playing cricket in the warmth of the sun. Friends in Canada sipping tea in the cold of winter. Students in Ghana reading by lamplight. Each one separate, yet each connected, faintly, by the long story of the empire, in the shared traces it left behind. And so, the British Empire, once so vast, has become something softer, not an empire, but a memory, a collection of ties that still linger. It is no longer the story of maps and rulers, but of people, of simple daily moments, of shared traditions that continue quietly, like threads woven into the fabric of life. Now, as this story comes to a close, let your mind grow still. Picture a map of the world, not filled with lines or colors, but as a globe turning slowly, oceans deep blue, lands a patchwork of green and gold. Imagine it turning gently, calmly, steadily, like the rhythm of your own breath. The empire has ended, but life carries on, in homes, in families, in the small details of each day. And as you listen to these words, perhaps your eyes grow heavier, perhaps your breathing slows. The story of the British Empire is long, but like all stories, it must come to rest. Let it settle now, like the evening quiet after a long day. Let the centuries drift away until all that remains is peace, calm, and the steady comfort of sleep. Good night.